Hey y'all, this is Benjamin Boyce. Over the last few days, I've been having a series of Skype discussions with Patrick Lee Miller, who is an associate professor of philosophy at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. I first ran across Patrick by reading an article published in Quillette magazine, which y'all should check out. It's providing a series of very insightful and deeply thought out essays and articles about modernism and postmodernism and the state of debate right now in higher education and in our society at large. And what really struck me about Patrick's view of the debate between modernism and postmodernism is that postmodernism does have valid critiques of modernism, that modernism could use to better its position and to truly grow into a more and more inclusive, more and more liberal society. So we've had a series of interviews or discussions with one another, and in typical Benjamin fashion, I messed up the audio on the professional version of our discussion. So what I have now to offer you is our really relaxed, leaning back on couches, wearing hoodies, and just chatting it up kind of interview, which I guess more or less aligns with his Platonic viewpoint of the world. And by Platonic, I mean just a bunch of guys just sitting around chatting it up. So I hope you guys enjoy. Check out his articles. I've linked them in the description. And this kind of comes in mid-sentence. He's talking about what it is to be a liberal individual. He's kind of defining what a liberal individual is. So here you go.
Liberal individual has what I call mental containers. So let's say I've got one mental container. Mm-hmm. Let's say you've got one mental container. If I say something to you and you are thinking about it, you can first put it in the mental container where it's sort of separated from who you are, your emotions, and so on, your identity. And you can look at it and evaluate it and decide, is this true or is this false? And if it's true, then I'll sort of take it out of the container and integrate it into myself.
Okay.
If it's false, I can keep it in that container, for future reference. When I want to understand somebody else who has that false view, I have a better, way to understand them because I've got it in this container with the apparatus of analyses that I've already given to it. If you don't have mental containers, imagine what it's like when you hear things with which you disagree. They immediately go into yourself and you feel threatened by them.
It's an act of violence.
It's an act of violence, exactly. I mean, this is sort of my psychoanalysis of what's going on with people who think words are violence, is they don't have mental containers. And, it's a complex process, I think, by which one gets mental containers, and I'm not saying I understand it. Like I said, that's the part of the book I want to work on more.
Okay. But
good education, in the broadest sense, a good liberal education would train people to have mental containers. That would be one of its main goals.
Okay. But how does that attach to like a liberal character or somebody with innately liberal qualities? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, that's what I was saying. But of course, it depends what you mean by liberal. So the notion of liberalism that I'm working with, that's in that Platonism paper, is, sure, the typical classical liberal values of due process, freedom of speech, and so on. But as I argue in that paper, I think a lot of the postmodern critiques against liberalism are correct against liberalism's epistemology and its ontology insofar as it has one. Here, let me explain. If your idea of liberalism is that everyone should be free with no notion of what freedom's for, then you're going to get, you could get a totalitarian system where, we're going to use our freedom to exert our power over the rest of Europe, for example. There'll be a cult and celebration of the will as the locus of freedom. I'm not saying that's necessary, but that's possible. So to ensure against that, at least philosophically speaking, freedom has to have a purpose. Freedom itself can't be the goal. There has to be freedom for something.
Yeah.
And the basis that I'm giving it in Platonism is that the purpose of freedom is to pursue the truth. And in fact, the best way to pursue the truth is when you're free. You can't pursue the truth most efficiently when you're compelled to do so. So I'm not sure, where were we in answering your question? A liberal character.
Yeah.
So what is a liberal character then? A liberal character is someone who's able to pursue the truth freely. And in order to do so, they're going to need these mental containers.
Okay. But is that something that one acquires, or is it innate?
I think well, that's a vexed question, but I would say I suspect it's mostly to be acquired.
Okay.
But even if it's innate, there are going to be degrees of the extent to which it's innate, and there are going to be educations that can be given to improve those who don't have it to the highest degree, and there are going to be those who have it in the most innate way possible, but still need to be complemented by a thorough education. So the premise of a liberal society is that everybody's able to do that to some extent, and that everybody's entitled to the kind of education that could give them the mental containers and the techniques for pursuing the truth insofar as that's possible in their station.
Okay. But
that's a real question in Plato. Plato thinks there are three types of people: truth lovers, honor lovers, and money lovers, and that only the truth lovers should get the kind of education I'm talking about. The premise of a liberal society is everybody should get that kind of education.
Because you want the honor lovers and the money lovers to have some notion of the truth, and you want the people who love truth to have some measure of bravery and the ability to run a household correctly.
That's right. So his way of solving that is that the truth lovers should get educated at every level, especially the honor-loving warrior level, and that you'll take the best warriors and make them into philosophers, but that not every warrior will get trained as a philosopher, and certainly all the money lovers won't get trained either as warriors or. So he's got, this model of a pyramid where you everybody starts with a certain education, at least at the warrior level, and then you filter out the philosophers. The liberal premise, at least as we've operated in America, as you know, is that people aren't born with three different natures, or at least if they are, it's not the state's role to determine who's which. And as a result, we get an education system which tries to give everybody the possibility to pursue the truth.
And, it's evidently doing that ineptly at the current time. Right. There was an article in, I think it was the New Boston something, where a law professor gave a speech to his students. I don't know if you've seen this, about how he basically says that you guys are not educated yet. Like, you guys have all these isms, so for the duration of this course, you're not allowed to use any word that has an ism on it, and he defines the different words. And if you do use those words, you have to cluck like a chicken, if you can't define what you actually mean by it, But he was kind of confronting the illiberal attitude that students have right now. Have you encountered that with your students?
I haven't. My university is always 10 years behind the times. So in this case, that's a good thing.
What's your acceptance rate right now?
I think it hovers around 75%.
Okay. Is it a public institution?
No, it's a private Catholic university in Pittsburgh.
Cool. What are you teaching right now then? What's freshest in your...
The course that I'm really into right now is called America and Antiquity.
Oh, okay.
And we start by reading the Constitution, the United States Constitution, and then the debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists for a couple of weeks. And then the rest of the course is reading Greek and Roman authors, the very Greek and Roman authors whom the founders, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, used in their debates about the U.S. Constitution. Because although obviously they had a lot in mind when they forged the U.S. Constitution or objected against it, current events, for example, the Revolution, the British Empire, European history, very prominent in their debates is citation of Greek and Roman authors. So, for example, the Federalists, who won the day, they're primarily the writers of the Constitution, they were really worried about Athenian democracy. They saw the disaster that Athenian democracy was, the way in which it destroyed itself in the Sicilian expedition, the way it executed Socrates, and so on. Okay. And the way it ostracized some of its best leaders, because it was mob rule. Everybody had a vote about everything, and it was fickle, and the sophists trained people to influence the crowd, and whichever speech the Athenians heard last, that's the decision that they made. And the Federalists were horrified by this, and they thought, we need a government that has a number of bulwarks against mob rule. Okay. And so you get the Electoral College. You get a Senate that's appointed by state representatives rather than by direct vote, which was later changed, of course. You have representation, period, rather than direct voting, and so on. So the Federalists were drawing on Athenian democracy and trying to make sure that we weren't like Athens, that we were democratic, but we didn't make the mistake of Athens. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, they were really worried about Roman history and the Roman emperors and how horrible Tiberius and Nero were. And they wanted to make sure that we didn't have, especially a president who had the kind of power that a Roman emperor had. And so they looked at the Constitution, and they made a number of criticisms of it, but one of their main criticisms was that it looked too much like Rome, and the president need to be given fewer powers. They made other criticisms, as I say, but that was one of the major. So in that course, learning about ancient Greek and Roman history, that's the climate in which the debate about the U.S. Constitution was happening. So here we are now, especially after the election of Trump, for example, where you get just as with Bush the first time round, you get a popular vote loss and an electoral college victory, and people are sort of confused about why we even have this institution in the first place. Yeah. Go back to the debates that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists have is very clear. They're worried about Athenian democracy, and that's just one of, as they say, 4 or 5 tactics that they use to make sure that we weren't subject to the tyranny of the majority.
Yeah, or so it's the tyranny of the majority versus the tyranny of the tyrant. That's the
okay.
Kind of
so that's how I frame the course. That on one hand they're worried about the tyranny of the tyrant, on the other hand the tyranny of the majority. What they both miss, and let me back up. What they both miss is the tyranny of the few. So they both think the Roman Republic is the ideal government. They're trying to refound the Roman Republic because there you've got a Senate, you've got tribunes who represent the people, you've got the consuls who are kind of like the president. But and they used Polybius as their model. He described Rome as a mixed constitution, that the consuls were the one leader, the Senate was the few, and the tribunes represented the many. And so you'd have this government that would combine the one, the few, and the many and balance them against each other, and it would be stable and solve the problem of revolutions. But Polybius was wrong about the Roman Republic. It was not a mixed constitution. It was an oligarchy. Basically, the Senate ruled. The tribunes really didn't have that much power as compared with the Senate. And the consuls were only there for 1 year, and they were senators. So it was the Senate that ruled. And, that's still a problem in the United States, is are we an oligarchy or not? To some extent, we were designed to be an oligarchy, to protect against the tyranny of the majority.
And do you see, I guess, so you're evaluating that with regards to like, how can we better our government? Do you think it's possible that we can better our system without dismantling it fully?
Yes. So what went wrong with the Roman Republic? 5 minutes, if I may. They took over the Mediterranean and they had no rivals, and tons of wealth started flowing into Italy, especially in the form of slaves. And so the small farmers, who populated the Italian peninsula couldn't compete with the major estates that were owned by senators. And the senators, of course, also controlled the political policies in Rome. And so they were bought out and, as a result, had no source of income and went to Rome. And so you had this doubling or tripling, I can't remember, the city of Rome in the space of like 50 years doubled or tripled. And the Italian peninsula was depopulated, was filled with rich senators and slaves. And of course, the rich senators were in Rome. And so what you have in the city of Rome is this dispossessed, bitter, aimless populace who formerly had jobs and self-rule, self-government at any rate, on their own farms. And now they're in the city of Rome, and they're easily swayed. Again, you have this problem that you had in Athens by speakers. But also the client system that was established had it so that senators would have a network of clients among these people. And so, for example, if a senator is going up for an election to be consul, for example, he can hire gangs of these people to intimidate the opponent. And there was one guy, I think his name was Bibulus, who bad enough to be named Bibulus as it is, but he couldn't leave his home for a whole year because the gangs would have beaten him up if he'd gone out into the streets. And he was one of the consuls. His rival didn't want him to share power with him. Anyway, long story short, that it was a diagnosis of Noah Webster, one of the framers of the U.S. Constitution. He wasn't at the convention, but he was a major Federalist. And it was his understanding of the disaster of the Roman Republic that it wasn't able to maintain relatively, as he put it, relatively tolerable distribution of property, that there was just too much income inequality. You had this massive gap between the rich senators with their slaves on the one hand and the dispossessed poor of the city of Rome. And that created, great social instability. Generals conscripted these people into armies, conquered more, brought in more slaves. The cycle just accelerated. And Aristotle diagnosed this problem in the politics. He said if you get too much gap between rich and poor, it's going to oscillate between favoring the rich, favoring the poor, until eventually you get a tyranny. So to fast forward to 2017, or at least the last decade, what's one of the major problems with the economy? I think it's this major wealth inequality that we have. And so if we want to keep the mixed constitution that the framers gave us, it can't exist in a vacuum. There has to be an economic substratum of relatively tolerable distribution of property for it to persist.
And do you think that there's an apparatus that can do that? Is there's some sort of intentional state-funded way to redistribute wealth, or?
Well, I'm curious about universal basic income. I'm not dogmatically for it. I haven't investigated enough. I've read some of the criticisms, some of which seem good too. So I'm not advocating that as a solution, but I think that's something that should be discussed in this context.
Okay. So one of the things that you see that's going to lead to tyranny is wealth inequality.
Yeah. I mean, it's what happened in Rome, exactly.
Is wealth inequality have anything to do with the extreme polarization that we're experiencing right now in viewpoint and in discourse? Do you think they're causally linked in a way, or is that another problem?
Complicated question. I'm not an expert on it, but in the review I wrote of the Luce book for Quillette last month, one of the passages I cited is, to me, extremely interesting on this subject, that, I forget how many counties there are in the United States, but it's something like 5,000. And I'll get these numbers slightly wrong, but you'll get the basic picture. Yeah. I think it was 263 of the richest counties. In other words, without exception, the 263 richest counties in the United States all voted for Hillary Clinton. Yeah. And all the others, 4,660 whatever, went for Trump. Yeah. Now, it's not so simple to say the poor voted for Trump, the rich voted for Hillary Clinton. That's not true. If you do a finer grained analysis, actually the median income of a Trump voter is higher than the median income of a Hillary voter. So there are all kinds of ways to cut this. Yeah. But that is significant, that counties that are the richest counties were homogeneous in voting for one candidate. Counties that weren't among that elite group were homogeneous in not voting for that candidate. And I think that suggests separate cultures are created. So it's not so much your income, predicts who you're going to vote for, but that what culture you move in, what area you move in, what people you associate with in will predict it. That seems to me to be true. Most of my friends are Clinton voters. I only have one friend who's a Trump voter. And to my other friends who are Clinton supporters, they don't have any friends who are Trump supporters. And so I'll often say, well, they'll have a picture of a Trump voter in their mind and the kind of views that person has, and I'll say, well, it doesn't fit with the one person that I actually know. Yeah. And they're kind of shocked because for them, it's like talking about a Martian, like, wow, you actually know one of these people. Yeah. And that just shows, certainly in the American Academy, how distinct the difference is.
Yeah, the Academy seems to be, from what I've read and experienced in investigating it, seems to be rather insulated from the conservative outliers.
Yeah.
And it seems like I read somewhere that the danger of the Academy not representing at all the populace that it's supposed to serve, and the tensions that are there. And I don't know if you're aware of that, or if you're worried about that, or if your cohort.
Yeah, I'm very worried about that. I mean, the person who's best on that is Jonathan Haidt. I don't know if you follow his talks and so on, but at Northeastern colleges, it's something like 20-1 liberal to conservative among the professoriate, at least in the humanities and social sciences, which are the fields that I know. It's slightly different in business and science and so on, but it's dramatically become more and more polarized in the last 20 years, and that's the significant fact. Yeah, so that's one of the best explanations for why it is that in the last 2 years, there's this precipitous drop among Republicans in their esteem for universities. Yeah. All my academic friends, when they see that statistic, most of them at any rate, they say, oh, well, that just shows how crazy people who are Republicans are now. They're so crazy that they dismiss universities. And there's some truth to that, but there's also a truth that I think they're not willing to acknowledge, which is, the kind of stuff that happened at Evergreen State is getting into the media and out into the American consciousness, and people think, I don't like what's going on there. That doesn't represent me at all. I think that's part of why that's happening, the decline in support among Republicans.
Well, I don't know. So you're at a Catholic university, so Catholics they skew a little bit more conservative, generally,
Yes.
socially, or
Well, it's hard to say. I would say that the students at my university, yes.
okay.
I don't have a good sense. But for example, the day after the election, I was walking into class and just bumped into another student as I was walking down the sidewalk to the class, and just asked, what is your sense of the affiliation of the members of our class? There were 35 students in the class, and I didn't know any of them personally, and I didn't know the student either. Just happened to bump into her, and because I'd been giving some quite strident lectures against Trump that week, because I was teaching Plato's Republic, and I just happened to be teaching Book 9. I teach a course that's Plato's Republic, starts in August, ends in December. Book 9 falls right on election week by chance, and Book 9 is about the tyrant and how a democracy gets converted into a tyranny. And it was prophetic. I mean, you check off the things that Trump said in the campaign, and these were things that Plato said would happen when a democracy transforms into tyranny. Andrew Sullivan wrote an article about this 2 Mays ago, before the election. At any rate, I was curious. So how is this being received? What is the political affiliation of the students in the class? And she said that she was at an election viewing party, and she was the only non-Trump supporter at the party. Now, that's not a representative sample. That could have been just that party. But at any rate, I get the sense that my students are conservatives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you're not worried about being protested?
No, I would love that.
Do you invite that? Do you open your lectures with that?
What sense?
Well, I'm joking, but like this, what is the role of heated debate or even staunch debate in your courses?
Yeah. So, I don't talk about current politics unless it's relevant to what we're talking about in the course. So that's why I wouldn't have just spent a week criticizing Trump, which is not at all what I did, actually. But I wouldn't have spent a week in which there were many criticisms of Trump if it hadn't been Republic Book 9 about the transition of democracy to tyranny, and that Plato was saying these things and they were happening at that moment. Or, for example, in my American Antiquity course, when we were talking about Roman emperors and the absolute authority of the emperor, when Stephen Miller, Trump's advisor, was on right after the Muslim ban, and he was on the Sunday shows, and he said the authority of the president will not be questioned. Mm-hmm. Or no, he said the will of the president will not be questioned. I said this is the kind of thing the founders were worried about, that people would say this kind of thing about the president. The anti-federalists especially were worried about it. So again, I don't try to be a lightning rod. I'm not out there to provoke students. I'm there to teach the material, whether it was, in that case, Tacitus or Plato. But if it provokes the students and it makes them upset in a way that makes them engage more in debate, that I want. And if I showed up on some list, I wouldn't mind that at all. I mean, I wouldn't want a target put on my face, for example. Yeah. But if I showed up on a list that said this is a controversial professor, as long as the checks kept coming, I wouldn't mind. Because I would want students coming to the class who, either were passionately for what I'm saying or passionately against it, so that we would have a good debate. The biggest problem I have with students at my university is apathy.
Oh, okay. What do you mean by that, then? Or how does that manifest?
Here's an example. When I gave an interview, I'll just give you the example of the week on tyranny. From Plato's Republic and these comparisons that I made. If it's true that they were all Trump supporters, it's amazing because no one objected to anything I was saying. Okay. I felt like I was, at a certain point, I was deliberately trying to provoke them into some kind of discussion and couldn't get them into anything. And I don't know to what extent that's this generation, to what extent it's this clientele of this school. I expect it's more this clientele because you were at Evergreen, obviously a very different kind of student body.
Yeah. Yeah. So you don't feel, because you guys are 10 years behind the times, you're still in the .com boom then, I guess. No, that would be the Obama era, I guess you guys are still.
We're still with Coldplay.
Okay. So do you feel that social justice or postmodernism creep, or like the pressures that have been rising at Evergreen and other colleges by the
It's
postmodernists?
there, but it hasn't affected me in any bad way,
Okay.
as far as I can tell. So, for example, I taught a gender course called Gender, Nature, and Being that I cross-listed with women's and gender studies.
Okay.
And I taught evolutionary psychology in that class.
Okay.
Now, I don't know I gave them what I was going to teach, so I didn't hide anything from them. I don't know if they'd focused on that, whether they still would have approved it or not, but they did. And I was transparent about what I did, and I didn't get any complaints about it afterwards.
Okay.
So, while I suspect that, everyone on that committee would have been critical of Damore's memo, for example, another thing I wrote about for Quillette, nonetheless, they allowed me, somebody who supported the Damore memo, to teach in the women's studies program. So, for example, in that class, I taught evolutionary psychology for almost a month, evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology for almost a month, but I also taught Judith Butler for 2 weeks.
Okay.
I taught Aquinas and Robert George, a Catholic moral theologian at Princeton, on gender and sexuality. So the whole point was to throw it all out there. Now, I'm especially interested in evolutionary psychology, so I spent more time with that than any other topic. Yeah. But and I don't teach the Butler as a cover. I think Judith Butler has some interesting things to say, and I try to extract the truth from any author that I read.
Okay. She's a name that comes up when people want to bash on a lot of the extreme gender stuff,
right.
the performativity, and I just did an episode on Evergreen where I show an interview by the current multicultural advisor, and she just spends like 5 minutes going through all the different identities that she has and wants to be everything at the same time, but at the same time, like, where's the self? Where's the individual in all this proliferation of identity?
So that's one of the major criticisms that I have of Judith Butler. I wrote an article about that very point, that I think there's a lot of truth to this notion of performativity. We could talk more about how I understand that, why I think there's a lot of truth in it, but that what she loses is the notion of the performer who's doing the performance.
Okay.
And that's not accidental. That's quite deliberate. She gets her theory of selfhood from Nietzsche, and she cites him when this point comes up. And Nietzsche says in the passage that she cites that we don't distinguish the lightning from its flash. There's no substance, the lightning, that then flashes. There's just lightning flashing.
Okay.
Language, Nietzsche says, tricks us into thinking that there's a subject, lightning, that's the noun, and then there's a verb, flashing, and that's a performance of the lightning. But in fact, what is the lightning? It's the flash. And Nietzsche's point is, in analogy with the self, there are our actions, our performances, and if you say Benjamin Skyped, there's an illusion created by language that there's a thing Benjamin, and then there's the performance Skyping, but that you're just like lightning. There's Benjamin Skyping. That's the thing, if you like, or that's more accurately the performance. So I think that's a fascinating notion. I think it's wrong.
Okay.
And the source of the error is Nietzsche, as so often with stuff that Butler does. I mean, I love Nietzsche. I think he's right about a lot of things, but he's also wrong about a lot of things. And that's one of the things that he's wrong about, because certainly it ends up doing her a disservice, because she's all about empowering people and giving people agency and so on. And there's no agent in her philosophy to whom power can be given.
There's just agency.
Right.
Which it might cause that scramble for more and more identities, because there's no postulated self, and then that causes a heightened sense of insecurity. So I need more and more identities and more actions, because I don't have a grounding in anything other than that which I am seen as doing. I don't even do anything until somebody else sees me and witnesses me. Because I've seen that a lot with Evergreen, like with these. There's certain very big actants there, but they're scrambling for attention. That they don't have a sense of self outside of the eye of the public, and so how do you even help that? And then so people are kind of guilt tripped into giving them attention and continually giving them attention. But what do they do with the attention? They just act out. They don't even put that attention back into some sort of socially beneficial, feedback loop in a way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the reason why Butler adopts this, again from Nietzsche, and Nietzsche thinks that if you've got the idea that there's a soul and then the soul performs, not only is that not real, he thinks the reason why that notion was invented was to punish other people. So, if I've committed a crime in your eyes and you're the judge, there's Patrick Miller committed this crime. Instead of just saying there was crime committed, if you're going to punish me, you need there to be a thing that persists, that did that action, that you can distinguish from the action, and that you're going to correct this thing so that it won't do it again. You need that distinction ultimately between the soul and the action. I mean, you don't need the metaphysical soul, but that obviously is an elaboration of this notion, because if you can't punish the person in this life, then you'll get to punish them in the next life, or you'll do it in addition. So Nietzsche thinks that the notion of agency is a product of resentment, the desire to punish, and that, that's ultimately his analysis of Christianity as well, is that it stems from the resentful slaves. Yeah. So, I was going to originally say something about Butler, and I've kind of lost the track now. But I think that's part of her critique, that you've got to take away this notion of the agent. She doesn't see it as a shortcoming that she doesn't have an agent. She thinks that's good, because now I'm getting away from this long historical pattern of resentment and punishment, and I'm freeing people. But again, who are the people whom you're freeing? Oh yeah, you're just letting more lightning out. Yes. But a lightning needs cloud and earth. Like the lightning is a relationship between one thing and another, which are still things, right? There's still with regards to the lightning, there's still actual things that are there. So you're obviously a Platonist, as I am. I have friends who are Nietzscheans or Deleuzians, the kind of philosophies that spell this out. And, they're very clever people. And, I'll make those kinds of objections and they'll have replies. And there's no terminus to that discussion. I've come to the point where I believe that, these are just different worldviews. Okay. And that doesn't mean that they're both right, but that you can't refute them immediately with that kind of objection. I mean, I'm as guilty of it as you are in this case, because I gave an objection as if, well, that's why I'm done with Butler. Well, that's why I'm done with Butler, because, from all the other presuppositions that I bring to this discussion, that's a decisive argument. But it's not a decisive argument to her and the many clever people I know who are part of that worldview, because they've got replies. It's just I don't accept that replies, and then we get into another discussion about the nature of being and becoming, or nothingness, and so on. And we get into some pretty deep water philosophically. Obviously, that's not happening at Evergreen when somebody is saying these are my 51 identities, and you've got to respect them all. Yeah, and you have to fluidly respect them too, and constantly change how you respect me based on which identity I'm. There's this. I mean, I turn up that philosophy to 11, and I see absolute chaos, like absolute proliferation of rules upon rules upon rules that are constantly contradictory and don't have a lot of coherence, except for based on the charismatic force of whoever's pronouncing the rules. So it all becomes performance poetry, and then so the way to critique performance poetry is to critique it aesthetically. And to say, okay, well, are you aesthetically good or not? Is this shitty poetry or is this good poetry? So there's still some sort of way to evaluate that I think that can have a response that leaves the logical arguments aside and just says, okay, well, let's go into this view. But then people try to get away from that too. I got two things to say. They're different subjects. One is on this point about poetry and the evaluation of poetry as poetry. I've seen that so much in continental philosophy, which is the orientation of my department and of the broader area of the philosophical world that I move in as a result of the orientation of my department. And Heidegger is the founding figure of this tradition, and he was the one who, not the original one, but one of the major figures who thought that philosophy needs to be less like an argument and more like a poem. Okay. And the irony is that the epigony of that tradition, if that's your notion of poetry with the jargon-filled, books that you write, that's just really bad poetry. The other irony, and now I'm realizing these points are connected, the other irony is that you're absolutely right that the performance of these identities brings in a bunch of rules, how you've got to address me by this, and you've got to use this particular word, otherwise you're committing violence against my identity, and so on, and the proliferation of all those rules, and we'll punish you, we'll shame you if you don't obey all these rules. The irony, this is a very deep irony, it seems to me, the irony is that if you trace that ideology back to that Nietzschean notion of subjectivity that I mentioned earlier, Nietzsche's critique was you got to get away from the agent or the soul because that's what people invent in order to punish other people. Then you can see, okay, the Nietzschean critique gets taken over by Butler, then it gets proliferated by this culture, which has now twisted itself to the point where it's doing the very thing that Nietzsche said don't do, and why he adopted that view of subjectivity in the first place.
Yeah, it turns into infinite resentment, uncapped, unregulated resentment.
Yes. Well, and that was one of his big problems with Christianity, is that it's not enough to hate people in this life. You're going to have to hate them for eternity.
Yeah.
It's not enough to punish somebody in this life. They're going to have to be in hell for eternity. What would you have to do in the space of a human life to suffer justly an eternal punishment?
Not believing.
That's Nietzsche's critique. And you're right that it's getting reduplicated in a secular form now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The manner in which they persecuted Brett Weinstein and then the president of the college, they had like this basically a struggle session, and they didn't know that they were creating a Chinese struggle session.
Yeah.
A Chinese girl actually stood up in the middle of this and in broken English said, "This is what you guys are doing is exactly what happened in China, right?
Wow.
These people aren't racist. You can't just call people racist." And then she was shut down like, "Oh, you don't understand what you're talking about. Like, they are racist.
Right.
You just don't see that because you're light skinned. You have light skin privilege, But when I go through the videos, and I was even involved in a session, one of my classes turned into a struggle session, is that the people who are doing the punishing, they get joy out of that punishment of punishing the white people. And then it's not enough. They're like, well, we need a little bit more. We need a little bit more. And so they finally get somebody to start crying. And then they get to laugh. They get like a little bit more glee out of that. But I could see how that could easily slip into violence. Because like we have to kill somebody to really get the pleasure out of it. And I see that that's the way that it heads. It tends towards violence because it's not satisfying. There's no satisfaction because somebody acquiesces to your criticism. You're like, but I need struggle. I need more struggle. I need resistance. So with regards to Brett, they called him. They started calling him like one thing, but like eventually they called him a racist, and then eventually that's not enough, so you're a supremacist, and then that's not enough, so you're a Nazi. So I see that inflation of the epithets. Just and it reaches a point where it doesn't make any sense. Like everybody's a racist now, everybody's a supremacist now.
Yeah. You no doubt listened to the Lindsay Shepherd tape that's circulating, and of the many things one could say about that, one would be that the Inquisitor said, "Well, look, I'm not going to compare Jordan Peterson to a Nazi," and then acted as if Jordan Peterson were a Nazi.
Yeah. Yeah, it's ridiculous. And the problem that I have with that, well, there's a few problems. One, that the guy's in a position of power, and which just turns it into an inquisition, right? But the deeper problem I have with that is that this is supposedly a professor, and the first thing that he can do to critique his enemy is to compare his enemy to the worst enemy that he can think of. He hasn't actually engaged with Jordan Peterson and has like a deep critique. And his whole, what he wants to do is to cut down any sort of critique. And he doesn't even have a good critique of why they should shut down discourse with Jordan Peterson as an example.
Yeah, I mean, he's got an argument. I don't buy it, but I think we should give credit where the little bit of credit is due. The argument is that here's an analogy that somebody just gave me in a discussion. So this isn't the argument he made, but it makes that argument clear. This friend of mine was in a school, and a teacher was a bully, and the teacher said, so I'll make up a name, said to the class, like, let's come up with reasons why John is a loser. when John was a student in the class. These kids were, let's say, 10 years old. Mm-hmm. Now, that's obviously wrong. But wouldn't it also be wrong if the teacher said, let's have a debate. Half of the class say why John's a loser. Half of the class say why he's not a loser. That would also be wrong. Yeah. Because John shouldn't be put on trial that way in a class.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's absolutely the right analysis of that situation that my friend gave, who's sort of pro-social justice in the way that, you're criticizing. And the idea is that professor, and, I think this was the thought that he had, that, debating whether or not these pronouns should or shouldn't be used, if that was the precise debate, I'm not sure what the precise debate was, debating whether or not these pronouns should be used or whether they should be legislated or whether they shouldn't be legislated, that's like debating whether or not John's a loser. That's how it feels to the transgender person in the classroom.
Okay. Yeah, because that's the conflation or the difference. Because I'm like, it's in that example of John, we're going to debate whether John's good or bad. That's completely different than saying John has an idea. We're going to debate whether John's idea is good or bad. And that now within that argument, it's like, no, the idea is the person. The idea is the identity. And it might come back to the fact that they believe that there's no such thing as an individual. There's just an identity that's tied to an idea, that's tied to a belief system. And so that identity is under threat the moment you even bring it into question. Questioning is violence.
That's right. That's exactly what I would want to say there too. And then I would want to also add what I was saying earlier about mental containers. That Inquisitor's argument didn't accept as a possibility that the transgender person in that class would have a mental container and could take in and put into the mental container the idea that they shouldn't be called those pronouns that they want to be called, or it shouldn't be legislated that they should be called them, or whatever the hostile idea is supposed to be. But that when it's in the container, they themselves are not affected.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that has everything to do with whether you accept that there's a soul, and we don't have to get metaphysical at this point, but ultimately I do. I think you need to, but we don't have to at this point. But whether you accept the distinction between a soul and its actions, the very distinction that Nietzsche was trying to deny. Because if there's a mental container, that's saying there's something
that's
below
containing.
all of the identities. There's something below all the identities that you can put it into, and that it's not you. But like I say, I haven't worked that out, and I can already see a problem with what I said. So
what's the problem?
Well, I want to say the liberal individual has these containers, but I want to say that if you put something into the container, that it's not then becoming you. But I don't want to say as a result, if you are your soul, that when you put the idea in, you're putting it into your soul. I don't think that's what I'm trying to avoid saying.
Okay. Yeah.
So what I need is a theory of the person or the self where you are your soul and you can put things into mental containers that don't then become who you are. And I haven't sort of worked out the psychology of how that's all going to relate.
Yeah,
that's the part of the book that I'm working on.
The thing that makes me think of is that the distinction between the mind and the soul, or the brain, like I am not my brain. My brain is probably the best tool I have to interact between, or to formulate interactions between that which is I and that which is the world. There's multiple interfaces. So like with regards to your containers, that's happening in a mental space.
That's right.
That's between me and reality, or it's one way for me to interact with reality.
Yes.
But I do think that there's no self without the world. Like there's no self without the expression of the self. And there's no development of the self without iterative expressions of the self, and trying things again and failing and having a feedback loop with that.
Yeah, I wanted to agree with what you just said, disagree with what you said earlier, and cut the difference by saying when we say self, we can mean different things. We can mean temporal self, eternal self, self that gets educated, self that is the thing that is educated. There are a number of distinctions that we could draw, and I suspect we would draw them differently, you and I.
Yeah, well, it depends on the context.
So the Platonic view of the self is that there's this eternal soul, and that it gets reincarnated. And I realize, of course, that sounds crazy, but just listen to it for a minute.
Or incarnated, at least, yeah.
Yeah. And when it gets incarnated in a particular kind of body, a male body, a female body, transgender body, however you like. and then likewise into a certain body with certain skin color, which may or may not be significant in the society, and so on. So an able or disabled body, and so on. So all of the intersectional criteria are bodily criteria. Well, I'm not sure. I don't know intersectionality well enough, but they're very often tied to embodiedness. Yeah. That's why, for example, you hear critical race theorists and activists who have been influenced by critical race theory saying we've got to get black bodies out into the streets, or black bodies this. Really, it's a big emphasis on the body.
Yeah.
And in Platonism, as I understand it, the body is very important. So there's a bad version of Platonism, as I understand, or as I would criticize, say, well, all that matters is the soul, the body's irrelevant. And the reason why I don't buy that was ever Plato's view is, well, if that's the case, why wouldn't we just commit suicide and just be a pure soul? And Socrates clearly thought it was important to go on living and to educate people and to show up at parties and be clever and so on. So with that hierarchical notion of the self, where you've got the eternal soul, which is the real you, but then you've got this embodied self, which is an image of you, which you have to curate and take care of in the way that a film director will take care of the film, like to produce a good film. It's not like what's in the filmmaker's mind is the only thing that matters. He wants to get it out and to make it be a good film.
Yeah.
And I think Plato thinks, and I think there are good arguments to believe it's true, we've got that kind of relationship with our embodied self that we have to care for it as for a work of art. So I want to credit the intersectionality movement, the thinkers that I've read, the friends that I have who are into that stuff, with the insights that I think are true, which is they do say a lot about our embodied selves and the way in which different vectors of our embodiment intersect with one another to create, relationships and power differentials and so on. The mistake that they make from this Platonic point of view is they confuse that vector intersectional analysis with who we are.
Yeah.
So, here I am before you, and you can sort of look at me and make all your judgments about where I stand in these various vectors, and then say, well, that's who he is. He is white male, blah, 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 blah. And I'll grant that, yeah, that's my embodied self, but I don't think that's who I am ultimately. That's the role that I'm playing in this life.
That's how you're plugged in to the world.
Yeah, sure. And I do think that there's a two-way relationship. So I also want to credit what you said at the end earlier when you said, it's by acting that you become a self. I think that's the point of life. We don't just come here as fully formed souls and then get embodied. What would be the point? The whole point of embodiment is just like the film director's point in making the film. And once he conceives the film, is there any point in making the film? Yeah, so he can find out what the film is, so he can work on it and make it better. There's a two-way relationship between his idea and the thing that he's making. Yeah. So likewise between the soul and the body, in my view, the Platonist view. So that, just to repeat myself, the intersectionalists, they're making some good points that I want to pay attention to. It's just, I get sad when I think it's a lost opportunity because they've gone too far in their understanding of selfhood and located it at the intersections of all those vectors. And I think the origin is that Nietzschean notion of the self that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
A lot of what I see in postmodern discussions and to some extent in postmodern thinkers is recapitulation of the Greek sophists. So,
that's what I've been thinking a whole lot about. It's all about rhetoric power, but rhetorical power.
That's right.
Is center. It goes back to that performance poetry. It goes back to that, like, I'm going to, shock and awe you. I'm going to blitzkrieg you with my verbiage skills or something like that.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I think Platonism is the philosophy of the moment, although nobody but me will think that, and probably no one will ever agree. Because what is Plato doing? He's got a positive philosophy, but in his critical aspect, he is criticizing the sophists. He's got all the repertoire right there for criticizing the sophists. So, for example, just on Twitter today, somebody, in their 40 characters that, according to social constructionism, everything is socially constructed except the truth of social constructionism.
Yeah.
Right. Classic refutation of relative except for that truth, the truth that all things are relative. Yeah. That critique is in Plato's Theaetetus that Socrates makes against Protagoras, one of the most famous of the sophists.
Okay.
So as I say, I think, a lot of the moves that people who are critical of postmodernism and intersectionality and so on are already there in Platonism.
Yeah.
And I don't offer that as a way to say, like, go back into Plato and rate him for things that, can win your battle. But rather, here's a guy, a problem coming 2,500 years ago, and is worth going deeper into just for that fact that he was that prophetic.
Yeah.
In other words, there's probably a lot going on here than just the simple refutation of relativism. And that's why, just so I don't seem as crazy as I might otherwise, take the doctrine of reincarnation, for example. For a long time, I thought it was crazy and not worth really seriously considering. But once I started seeing how many things Plato was right about philosophically, I thought, well, I'll give this a chance. What are his arguments for it? Why does he believe it? And I think the arguments are pretty good. They're not knockdown arguments. Again, they have to take place within an ambit of premises that one already accepts, having been, convinced by other parts of the philosophy. But, it's not an unreasonable view to hold. And it also turns out to be kind of crucial for understanding many of the things that he believed that some people still believe, but don't have that aspect to it. I mean, for example, if you think life is an education, which you have in Christianity, life is an education. Why? Because you've got to get to heaven, so you got to prepare yourself to be worthy of that entrance exam. Any longer, but they still are acting as if they're preparing for something.
Yeah.
And what are they preparing for exactly? And then nihilism would be a reaction saying, well, we're not preparing for anything, so now I don't care about an education.
Yeah.
It's all about pleasure or whatever.
Or power. Yeah.
Plato's not a Christian, but he believes. Yeah, Plato believes in reincarnation. So yeah, every incarnation you have is an education. So just because you don't get it all this time, don't sweat it. You're going to have a lot of other chances.
Mm-hmm. In a sense, though, whether or not reincarnation or the eternal recurrence is true on an individual level is certainly true on a societal level.
What do you mean?
Like what you're saying, because I've been thinking about this with postmodernism or its various manifestations since going to Evergreen, going there 4 years ago. I'm like, well, I see they're still stuck in 90s. The PC culture war, they're ramping it back up again, and then thinking about it deeper, I'm like, this is rhetorical sophistry. This is the sophist versus the Platonists or the academe or whatever the other group was, the anti-sophists back then. And why are we retreading this ground? And what do sophists actually bring to the table that are missed by Socrates and his ilk, and what, because like as a poet and as somebody who's very interested in mythology and thinking that stories are the best way for us to communicate very complex human psychological truths between generations, but stories don't work out logically. They work out dramatically, and so I think sophistry and it emphasizes the drama, emphasizes the poetry, and so you need to have that, and you need to understand that it has a boundary, but it also does something that's going to be lost out if everybody's in a Socratic dialogue all the time,
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, except for maybe that last part. But here's what I wanted to say just a few minutes ago: that take the Platonic dialogues themselves; they're dramas.
Okay.
And there's a dialogue, the Gorgias, that I'm a big fan of. And in that dialogue, Socrates gets in a debate with Gorgias and his students, and it really becomes a debate between Socrates and Callicles, one of Gorgias's best students. Well, in that story, at any rate. And Plato, I think he does a good job of giving the other side their due. In other words, there are dialogues where there are silly sophists and they get dismissed for superficial reasons or easily enough because they're not producing good reasons. So he's dramatizing in the Gorgias the failure of Socrates to Callicles, not because Callicles is too thick to get it, but because those are irreconcilable worldviews.
Okay.
And I originally intended to turn that into a much longer work, present that incommensurability between Socrates and the sophist, and then complement it with Plato and say Plato's trying to rise above this and give a solution to this incommensurability.
Okay, yeah.
And I started that MA with a quotation from Foucault because I wanted to say Foucault is the new Callicles, or one of the many new Callicleses, and that's making that comparison between the postmodernists and the sophists that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Who are the Socrates? So I think a lot of the liberals or the proponents of modernism in the kind of debates you see on Quillette or Aereo magazine.
Okay.
I don't think that is entirely even. I mean, I clearly tilt more towards the modern due to the postmodernists in that debate, but I think there are flaws in both. That's what I present in this forthcoming thing from Quillette. That's why I present Platonism as the philosophy everybody needs in order to move past this draw.
Okay. Yeah, I do appreciate the drama that Plato brings to it. I think that brings the human element that saves it a lot from the problem of hyper analytic philosophy and the problem of postmodern stuff, is that it's no longer rooted in two people in a room.
Right. It becomes very abstract.
Yeah, we always have to remember that, I guess, in a way. Well, I should get going.
Well, look, I'm looking forward to it. It's sort of a pity that we talked about all this and that this stuff won't be in the interview.
Well, you know what? I'm testing out my screen recording equipment, so if it does work out, then I'll let you know if this is adequately recorded or not. But we always have this as a scratch pad and evidence that you watch Netflix.
All right. Well, I'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah. Have a happy Thanksgiving.
Okay. You too. Bye-bye.